My name is ellisonmad. I'm from Zimbabwe. I was born in Masingo, and I have been a social worker for some time. And I feel that a great deal of Africa has been lost to archives. The grand of African kingdoms, the problems of conflict in the country or in the continent have persuaded me to consider the chronology of the contradictions therein from ancient times through to the Zimbabwe situation to the present day. I would like to trace the grand of African kingdoms. I recall King Ramesses in Egypt, Makeda, the Queen of Sheba in Ethiopia, and many other kingdoms. I would like then to zero in to the question of Africa and the movements within, taking cognizance of the fact that perhaps the first human beings have been found in Africa. And in particular, when I look at Zimbabwe, the first Homo sapiens was identified in Zimbabwe and carbon copied to be 1,000 years. So to me, it says there's been a lot of activity, a lot of livelihoods, a lot of maybe conflicts here and there from the historical angle, from the social angle, because I believe and I see that when we think of this Homo sapiens in Africa and trace his journey, we find him in places like China, we find him in places like the Philippines and Malaysia. They were then called the, Afroid, diminutive Afroids. Back home, they were called the pygmies or the dwarfs. And in my view, those are the original owners of the land in Africa. Before the partitions came through, before the contradictions around the political contradictions coming through the trend of history or the trend of the written history. It is a tragedy in my view that historians and archaeologists have acknowledged the grandeur of Africa, but they tended to have shelved them in the archives or in the museums of history and forgotten about it. My mission in this project is to highlight some of the important events in Africa and zero in to the chronology of the contradictions in Zimbabwe. And perhaps towards the end, I would like to cast a ray of hope for the future. Taurai zvinetsika guru zhinji rwevanhu kuti vanzwisisise zvakananga musangano. For me, it is the fact that the written history is not sufficient to convince the younger generations about the truth of what was. If we look at Zimbabwe, for instance, we see a people being part of the rest of Africa, kingdoms fighting somewhere around the Great Lakes, a land which we called the Guruswa, and people and kingdoms moving south to where some people before that in South Africa, there was Chaka the Zulu, Swangendaba, Mzilikazi, and Lobengula. They were there coming up, fighting others, and the Shona were coming down, also fighting. So the displaced person in this whole enchilada was the Bushmen, or the dwarfs, or the pygmies, whichever name you want to call them. They are now, the descendants of these people are now in Namibia, and they are called the Khoisan, where the original Bushman was called the Khoi. So the Shona came down and displaced the Khoi and took over the land and called it their own. And then slowly we begin to see Cecil John Rhodes coming down from South Africa with his dream of making a kingdom of Africa, starting from South Africa into Zimbabwe and on to Cairo. He had a wonderful dream, but an inconsiderate dream, and if not an egocentric dream. When we look at Zimbabwe, we shouldn't forget that Zimbabwe was a powerful kingdom on its own. If those who know the country, they recognize the grandeur of the great Zimbabwe ruins and the fact that people lived there, kings lived there. There was a lot of trade in gold, in ivory, in iron, and in slaves. And so it was that the first traders were the Arabs. And in the process of it, they took the ivory, the gold, and whatever was in the trade, and they gave us beads and clothing and cooking utensils. It was a thriving trade. It was a welcome trade. But then you see, it created rivalries. People wanted to trade with these people. People who were nearer the sea were trying to get to the sea, and the Portuguese also wanted to go inland and take as much as they could. So there was conflict in Africa long before the Chimurengas. There were wars with the Zulu people. There were wars with the Portuguese. There were wars even with the Swahili people, who were also rivals to the trade that was going on. Needless to say that the trade is not a new phenomenon. It was happening all the time in Africa. Up to the north, we had stations like the Timbuktu, and where slaves were, part of the trade. And that's why we find a lot of people of African heritage over in the Middle East, into China and Philippines, as I've said. And then we see also the coming down of the religions, where the Arabs brought in the Muslim religion, and where the Christians later on came in to inject the Christianity. But no, the pity of it is that people assumed that the people of Africa did not have a religion, and the people of Zimbabwe in particular did not have a religion. They were heathens. They needed to be converted. And so it was that the original religion, particularly when we think of the land was did not belong to anybody. The land belonged to God, and it was in the custody of the chiefs, who were the custodians of the land. So much so that that was the situation. The Shona believed in their god Mari, and to access Mari, you had to go through the Mudzimus, and so it was. Now, if we look at the kingdoms of Zimbabwe, particularly the kingdom of Munumtaba, for instance, Munumtapa was a powerful king in the land now known as Zimbabwe, from the Limpopo in the south to the Zambezi in the north to the Chimanimani Mountains in the east. So this was the powerful kingdom of it. But the structure of the kingdom was that the king sent out his chosen people to be provincial governors, to be crow heads all over the country, so that there was a structure of serfdom deriving the authority, their authority from the king. So it was in South Africa where the Chaka, the Zulu, was also having the same structures, where infighting and military jealousies were happening all the time. Trade was happening, slaves were going to the world, or the outside world, shall we call it, and so it was. So that was the scenario of the Zimbabwean, circumstance. I am saying that the people of Zimbabwe, everybody in the world over, must have come from somewhere, because I don't see a person identifying himself with a piece of land, even if grandfather and grandfather and grandfather lived on that particular land. It is not possible. This is why perhaps the rhetorics of politics in Zimbabwe begins and ends with, it is our ancestors' place and so on, it is our land. And if we were to ask some political personages to identify a piece of land where they came from, it is not possible. So again, land becomes a political kind of entity that has to be understood. How is it that it is so miserably important